Today, together with respected teachers and the enthusiastic students from Normal University, we are holding this academic seminar and lecture. Personally, I really enjoy participating in activities like this. Although I personally do not possess wisdom myself, nor do I truly have much extensive expertise in this particular area, I am certainly not what you would genuinely call a truly wise person in this specific field. I'm not just being modest here, I assure you. One should truly possess a deep sense of self-awareness. We ought to thoroughly understand what kind of knowledge we genuinely possess within ourselves. However, I do have a very great and profound interest in this particular area, especially in the comprehensive study of Buddhism and the broader field of religious studies. Today we are gathered here primarily to discuss the characteristics of Tibetan Buddhism, especially the unique aspects of Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism. Given the limited time, I may not be able to give a very thorough and complete account, because indeed what is called Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism is vast and profound, encompassing not only profound spiritual teachings, but also intricate practices, art forms, and historical developments. It is quite difficult to explain it clearly in such a short amount of time. There are certainly certain challenges that we face. I would like to share my thoughts as best as I can. First, I would like to briefly discuss some of the historical background of Tibetan Buddhism with everyone. Then, in terms of its lineage and the profound reliance on spiritual gurus, there are indeed many truly unique and distinctive features that set it apart. Generally speaking, many people mistakenly believe that the so-called Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism is entirely equivalent to Tang esotericism, that it appeared in the world for only a short period of time or emerged during a single dynasty is a common misconception, and was not particularly prosperous in the world. Some people also hold this view. Some people think that so-called Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism, as if all of Tibet studies esoteric Buddhism and all Tibetan Buddhism is esoteric Buddhism. There are also such views. In fact, the first type, that Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism was only prosperous for a certain period, is also unreasonable. Because from the very beginning of the establishment of Tibetan Buddhism up to the present day and time, although there have been periods of rise and decline in different dynasties and eras, there have indeed been some significant ups and downs, but even so it remarkably remains very complete and flourishing today. Whether it's its core doctrines, rich history, or various rituals and spiritual practices, all of them have been preserved completely and without damage. Therefore, Tang Esoteric Buddhism and Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism, as well as Tibetan Buddhism itself, cannot be simply equated. Some people mistakenly think that the so-called Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism is merely just a teaching method of Tibetan lamas. Some people refer to it as Lamaism, but this term is actually inappropriate or inaccurate. This is because the word Lama essentially refers to a monk or a spiritual teacher. And it should be noted that Tibetan Buddhism is by no means a tradition practiced exclusively by monastics. Its content and teachings are truly vast and profoundly deep, encompassing a wide range of philosophical insights and spiritual practices, as everyone knows. There is Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and Tibetan Buddhism. It is one of the three major Buddhist traditions in the world. In other words, after Indian Buddhism was transmitted to Tibet, it integrated with Tibetan culture and customs and developed into an especially vast and complex religious system. It has evolved into an especially vast and comprehensive religious system. It is comparable to our Chinese Buddhism. In fact, Chinese Buddhism is also the Dharma lineage of Shakyamuni Buddha's teachings transmitted to the Han region. Then it gradually turns into a religion, and it's exactly the same way in essence. So we truly think that if we regard all of Tibet as Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism, nowadays some people equate all of the Tibetan Buddhism with the Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism. This statement is definitely unreasonable. Esoteric teachings and practices found in Tibet did not actually originate independently in the Tibetan region itself. Rather, their true source can be traced back to India. Of course, when we examine the roots of history, especially considering that many people present here today are themselves dedicated researchers of history, we can see that at the very beginning of our Tibetan history, In the very beginning, it was like in ancient times when there was no Buddhism. Around the year 300 AD, a significant period in history, the first flourishing of Buddhism in Tibet began with King Latothori Nyansen. Some stupas and the Buddhist scripture, the Sutra of the Precious Box, mysteriously appeared and manifested themselves within the confines of his royal palace complex. There are also various other so-called blessed items which are considered significant. At that time, it was prophesied that in 5 dynasties in the future, people would be able to understand its teachings. Of course, when examined from a rigorous academic perspective, certain researchers argue that these miraculous objects did not simply materialize out of thin air or descend directly from the heavens above. They were brought over by some Indian panditas and other people. There are also different opinions. Of course, there are some historical issues. It may be difficult for us to give a precise answer right now. There are certain difficulties. This might be entirely based on reasoning or deduction, or only with archaeological and historical evidence can it be acknowledged. But for those who focus mainly on Buddhist teachings, not only is there a historical aspect, but there are also some very mysterious elements. For example, this is also the case with some historical transmissions in the Han region. So, if we look at it purely from an academic perspective, sometimes we can't reach a very accurate conclusion either. Such situations also exist in many cases. After another 5 dynasties, the revered individual who is widely recognized and venerated as the sacred incarnation of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, the great king Songtsen Gampo, the legendary founder of the Tibetan Empire, was born into this world. At this point, everyone knows Princess Wencheng, a prominent figure, and the princess from Nepal. They have brought the original statues of the Shakyamuni Buddha at the ages of 12 and 8 years old, respectively. Because at that time, Buddhism had already existed in the Tang dynasty, so they brought it up from here. From Nepal, they also brought a statue of Shakyamuni Buddha at age 8. They built the renowned Jokhang Temple and Ramoch Temple. According to historical records, Princess Wencheng was exceptionally skilled in the art of geomancy. From her perspective, she carefully observed the entire landscape of Tibet. Not only did they build a temple at the Jokhang Temple site, but they also established 4 guardian temples based on the overall topography of the Tibetan region. In various different places, they also had to build some additional temples. From this point in time, although the flourishing and beginnings of Buddhism had already, to a considerable extent, taken shape, the Buddhist scriptures and treatises as we know them, as well as the Tibetan people's understanding of Buddhist doctrine, was still quite limited. Of course, there are some historical records from that time, including during the reign of Songtsen Gampo, that maintained diplomatic and spiritual contacts with various monks and religious scholars from the Tang dynasty and engaged in meaningful Buddhist cultural and doctrinal exchanges with them. Subsequently, there was so-called Princess Jingqian, another Tang dynasty royal consort, because according to many historical records, Trisong Detsen can be verified as the son of Princess Jingqian. At that time, it can be said that Buddhism in Tibet was flourishing and complete. During that period, he invited many Indian panditas. Additionally, many translators, known as lotsawas, were trained in Tibet. They went to India for training and then began translating texts and so on. At that time, Trisong Detsen was said to be just about 13 years of age. He ascended the throne at the age of 13, which was particularly early. At the beginning, according to historical records from China, the Sutra of the 10 Good Deeds, Shalihotra Sutra, and the Diamond Sutra, these scriptures were brought to him by someone. After these texts were brought in when Trisong Detsen was young, he had read and recited some of the scriptures brought from the Han region and had some understanding of them. There are such accounts. Of course, at that time, as everyone knows, Tibet had always been a land that believed in Buddhism. Moreover, from the time of previous kings, people were required to practice the 10 virtuous deeds, cultivate virtuous actions, and recite mantras. Such virtuous practices were supposed to be upheld. But at that time, Chan Master Mahayana of the Chan school came from Dunhuang. At that particular time, Guru Padmasambhava had already departed from our sacred land of Tibet, and the Bodhisattva has also already passed away from this world. At this time, the Chan Master Mahayana began to promote Chan Buddhism in Tibet. Of course, this Chan practice. At that particular time, there were indeed many conflicts and significant contradictions between some of the gradualist schools in Tibet and the esteemed Chan school. Back then, even in important places like Sami Monastery and Jokang Temple, there was truly no one left to offer lamps in front of the Buddha statues. Why was that the case? Because at that particular time, the Chan school was already spreading everywhere in Tibet, saying, whether you do good deeds or bad deeds, everything is an attachment. You should let go of all attachments, attachments to good, attachments to evil. Just as white clouds can block the sun, so too can dark clouds. Any kind of cloud will truly block the light. In the same way, golden chains can bind you, and so can silver chains. Using the same analogy, doing good or bad deeds both cannot. Everyone was told not to be attached to anything at all. At that time, many people even started killing, thinking that no truly good deed should be clung to or held on to. This went on for a period of time. Later, following the prophecy of Bodhisattva, Kamalashila was invited from India because Bodhisattva and Kamalashila were from the same monastic college. They were both scholars of the Madhyamaka Svatantrika school. Then they began to engage in a debate with him. During the course of this debate, there was this saying, that is to say, in the beginning, Chan Master Mahayana taught everyone that non-attachment to everything is absolutely essential. Non-attachment to everything is the ultimate Dharma. It's like a magnificent great rock soaring freely and gracefully in the vast sky, completely unobstructed by anything at all. Kamalashla, Lotus Precepts, asked if the great rock originated from the ground, following a metaphor. Kamalashila asked him, what about great Garuda? Did it originally come from the ground? So where does it all end up in the end? In the end, he also had to admit that no matter how high the great Garuda flies, in fact, at the very beginning, it took off from the ground. And in the end, it still lands back on the ground. So according to the Madhyamaka or Vajrayana schools, the meaning is, no matter how high your realization is, the law of cause and effect, good deeds bring good results and bad deeds bring bad results. This most fundamental level in reality cannot be abandoned. Ultimately, even at the highest level of realization, practicing virtuous actions is indispensable. Later, regarding this analogy, it should be said that because at that time the king was also a witness, and both sides had this agreement. Whoever won could stay in Tibet. If anyone unfortunately failed, he must return. Kamalashila had to return to his homeland, India, and Chan Master Mahayana also had to return to Han region. That was the clear and established agreement at that particular time. Later, after he suffered a defeat, he then proceeded to go back. But as for his return, what we also need to understand is it was not because his view was wrong that he left. Of course, there are the gradual and sudden approaches. So here later, the omniscient Longchenpa, the Venerable Vimalamitra, also mentioned in the 7 treasuries of Longchenpa, that because some of the local seekers were unable to fully accept the highest realms of Mahayana teachings and principles. There was such a situation later. Many historians hold the view that, moreover, Chan Master Mahayana's view, especially in Chan Buddhism, should be considered, therefore, the highest state. But for those with a gradual disposition and who, moreover, progress step by step, this, however, presents certain difficulties indeed. At the time of the reign of King Trisong Detsen, there was indeed such a significant and important process that took place. I think this important point should also be mentioned here. Nowadays, whether we study Vajrayana in Tibet or Chan Buddhism in China, many people, including those in academia, believe all is empty and nothing clung to. If the basic foundations are not properly established, I'm afraid there will be certain difficulties. There's also another saying that at that time, Chan Master Mahayana had already left one of his shoes in Tibet. This means it was a kind of dependent origination, that is to say, later on in traditions like the Mahamudra tradition and the Nyingma school's Dzogchen, many people advocated non-attachment. Of course, in the end, there is this kind of non-attachment. The Avatamsaka Sutra also discusses this, and both Chan and Vajrayana traditions say the same. This can be acknowledged. But if you are non-attached right from the beginning, well, that's unreasonable. That's why later on many scholars from the Sakya school criticized the Nyingma and Kagyu schools. The reason for their criticism was that in many aspects they sometimes neglected the principles of karma and its results. Of course, those who truly practice the Nyingma tradition are not actually like that, but a very small number of individuals may not have understood its teachings. They become non-attached from the beginning. It's just like in Chan Buddhism, where some individuals also don't understand the most ultimate meanings of Chan. Some individuals enter a meditative state right from the very start. This phenomenon also happens too. This was roughly during the significant historical period of King Trisong Detsen's reign. It was the same back then. Why am I talking about this today? I'm thinking about what we call Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism. It is not just a small local religion from a very tiny place. It could be said that it can be regarded as a national religion throughout the generations in our Tibetan region, from the time when it first flourished in Tibet all the way to the establishment of the Tibetan nation. Later, it came to the period of Langdama's persecution of Buddhism. Before that, there were several generations. Just as the emperors before the Qing dynasty were continuously succeeded through a long-established line of inheritance. Generation after generation, they have all been followers of Buddhism. All the kings, starting from the monarch, were devoted followers of Vajrayana Buddhism. Moreover, I think that Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism is not limited to just the Tibetan region. It should be said that it also had a particularly deep and significant connection with Han Buddhism and many emperors of the Han regions. Indeed, there were some especially profound and deeply significant karmic ties that bound them, because this was basically the prevailing case during the Tang dynasty, a period of significant historical importance. But even during the Tang dynasty, there were some instances, as everyone already knows, including when the Tripitaka was being compiled and proofread during the reign of Trisong Detsen. Many great masters from the Han region were invited to participate. And also at the time when the 7 candidates were ordained, great masters from the Han region were also invited to come. There are such historical accounts which everyone knows. Then during the Song dynasty, according to Han historical records, most of the time Taoism was the dominant tradition. In this case, although Buddhism existed, its highest forms of propagation, especially our Tibetan tradition, did not enter. It was only at the beginning of the Yuan dynasty that Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism was not just limited to Tibet. It also flourished greatly among the royal families in the Han region. It is believed that the initial flourishing of these traditions actually began in Tibet, where first the Nyingma school was established, followed by the emergence of the Sakya and Kagyu schools, and finally the Gelug school. Different lineages thus emerge one after another. That's exactly how the situation is. At the very beginning of the Yuan dynasty, Genghis Khan, as everyone knows, or at least has heard of him, he is Mongolian. No matter what, he was an extraordinary hero. From the perspective of the Han region, many Han people may have different opinions about him. We Tibetans also have our own views about him. Why is that? Because he wanted to rule over many areas of the Han region as well as Tibet, and he even intended to go to India. He mobilized many troops preparing to pass through Tibet. At that time, there were 2 accounts regarding many monasteries in Tibet. One account says that everyone was extremely afraid back then, and that many monasteries were on the verge of facing danger. Another account says that at the time, he went to the Sakya master Jaba Gyatso to request teachings. After earnestly seeking and receiving these teachings, he abandoned his plans to go to India. He completely gave up the significant idea of waging a full-scale war and ruling there. From that point onwards, basically, that particular intention completely disappeared. After his time, it was Mongke who specifically took the esteemed Karmapa Black Hat Lama as his revered spiritual teacher. Then during the significant reign of Kublai Khan, there was a master from Nyingma school who was named Shakyaguang. Shakyaguang was an extraordinary Terton, a great master of revealed treasures. He went to invite the powerful emperor, but despite his earnest efforts, he was ultimately unable to bring him back. This significant event is precisely how it is described in the current, detailed Buddhist historical records. He generously offered his precious long-life water and various other profound longevity blessings to the esteemed emperor. Because of this important act, the numerous monasteries throughout Tibet later received many generous and substantial privileges. Some notable privileges were granted by Kublai Khan.
At that time, he also appointed Phagpa as the imperial preceptor. Shakyaguang was also made his imperial preceptor. This was the Sakya school, a significant and influential Buddhist tradition. Before this, there was Sakya Pandita. Everyone knows that Sakya Pandita was the teacher of Koden. At that time, Mongolia had basically already split into several parts. They've already been separated into several distinct parts. Koden served as his patron and disciple. Later, he passed away in the Gansu region. That's how it was. After Phagpa passed away, during the Yuan dynasty, as everyone knows, there were about a dozen emperors in the Yuan dynasty, 14 or so, something like that. Basically, up until the time of Emperor Huizong of Yuan, all of them practiced Tibetan Buddhism. Although the Mongols were the main ethnic group at that time, their primary faith was Tibetan Buddhism, and this was practiced throughout the imperial palace. There was also someone named Yungten Dorje Pal, who was a practitioner of the Nyingma school and the Great Perfection, Dzogchen. At the time of the esteemed Emperor Wudi of Yuan, he was honorably invited to the Grand Imperial Palace. He diligently taught the royal family the intricate Vajra dance and also carefully instructed the powerful emperor and the elegant empress. He gave the Great Perfection, Dzogchen, empowerment to the emperor, empress, and some close relatives who had a karmic connection. He taught many crucial and essential key points and secret instructions on mind training within the profound Great Perfection. He shared a great deal on this topic. Later on, as everyone knows, around the Ming Dynasty, at that time the Gelug school, including the Panchen and Dalai Lamas. From the third Dalai Lama onward, and with many people from the Han region, including the fifth Dalai Lama, especially during the time of the fifth Dalai Lama, some historical records state that when the emperor invited him at that time from Lhasa, there were as many as 3,000 devoted followers who accompanied him on his journey. At that time, there was also our national preceptor, Zhangjia. Speaking of Zhangjia, national preceptor, the second incarnation was national preceptor to Emperor Kangxi, the third to Emperor Yongzheng, and also the national preceptor of Emperor Qianlong. The fourth incarnation was the national preceptor of Emperor Daoguang. The fifth incarnation was the national preceptor of Emperor Tongji. There doesn't seem to be a clear record for the sixth incarnation. The seventh incarnation should have passed away before the Cultural Revolution. So I think for many aspects of Tibetan Buddhism, especially some of the Vajrayana practices like Kalachakra, Hevajra, and Dzogchen, at that time, these were highly, highly regarded at all levels. From the Ming Dynasty through to the Qing Dynasty and continuing all the way until the very end of imperial rule in China, there was a strong emphasis on Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, especially among the high-ranking members of the imperial family in the Han regions. This included the Karmapa Red Hat, Black Hat, the Dalai Lama, and the Panchen Lama, as well as many other respected lamas from various different sects. The emperors bestowed all kinds of titles upon them, such as the Gyalwa Karmapa, Dalai Lama, Panchen Lama, and Bashi, among others. It seems that during the Ming Dynasty, one of the emperors, there was a Ming emperor, he had already selected 8 Dharma kings. Even now in the Han regions, there are many Dharma kings, this Dharma king, that Dharma king. These are titles people use nowadays, but if we look at history, it is true, especially in the case of the Karmapa lineage throughout history has indeed had many extraordinary Dharma connections in this regard. I am thinking that, first of all the teachers and students present here today should seek to understand Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism by reviewing and reflecting on its historical development. This is indeed very important. Otherwise, like the way a very small number of people nowadays misunderstand Vajrayana, that is far from the truth. Because after the Cultural Revolution, as everyone knows, everything from before, including religion and much of traditional culture, suffered historic destruction and blows. It can be said that many truly admirable events and deeds that took place in the past have, possibly due to various factors such as political circumstances, historical changes, and other related reasons, unfortunately suffered some degree of damage or destruction. People's evaluations of it are quite different. I often think that nowadays many, including some actors in movies and television, their accounts and descriptions of various aspects of Tibetan Buddhism, as well as the states they claim to demonstrate, are often quite unreasonable and inaccurate. They should have brought people a completely different kind of experience. In fact, the content of our Buddhism should be that no matter who you are, you should present the true historical facts as they are. This is a very important and fair attitude. If you have some personal motives or use political means, that's another matter entirely. But for the academic community, for true intellectuals, it is possible to view Tibetan Buddhism positively, whether from a historical perspective, or from the current situation, or by understanding its actual practices. This point is especially important. Otherwise, as everyone knows, nowadays a very small number of people are particularly opposed to Tibetan esoteric Buddhism. What is the reason for this opposition? As I just mentioned, some may want to achieve certain personal goals. There are also such cases, and for some it may be unavoidable. For example, when we truly want to understand history, actually in the Han region, some things are not as ugly as they have been depicted by later generations. I have this feeling, for example, nowadays when it comes to the Yuan and Ming dynasties, including the emperors, and some of the ways they have been portrayed, especially as being extremely vicious and unreasonable, whereas during the Tang dynasty, sometimes by comparison, things seem a bit better. There are cases like this as well. Moreover, in our current history, there should be, like the Qing dynasty, in history you could say that from the time of Manchu rule. The Manchu rule lasted for over 200 years, but for many things about the Qing dynasty that are worth remembering, things that are worth promoting, we basically don't talk about them at all. The same goes for the Yuan dynasty, actually. Although it was mainly ruled by the Mongols, you could say that its cultural and political influence is overlooked, and its contributions are rarely acknowledged. Actually, in this process, there are also many valuable lessons and principles that we can learn from, or that are worth preserving for future generations, such as their spirit of resilience. During this ongoing process, many individuals, including those prominently featured in the media today, have expressed certain views. Some of the descriptions and comments they have made regarding Tibetan Buddhism are, in actuality, not entirely accurate or reflective of the true situation. Consequently, a persistent belief has always been held by some people that Tibetan Buddhism is entirely about practicing sexual yoga, about the act of killing, and about the consumption of meat. Indeed, if we look back at history, compared to Han Chinese Buddhism, we indeed still have some things it hasn't achieved. There are certain areas where we definitely need to learn from, including the concept of vegetarianism. Whether it's Tibetan monastics or lay people, we should look to some practices in Han Chinese regions, such as vegetarianism. These are all things worth learning. I wrote a book, The Esoteric View on Vegetarianism. Tibetan practitioners were not all meat eaters, not at all. There were actually quite a lot of vegetarians, but due to various historical reasons, there are still some areas where we need to learn from others. But some people, including certain scholars nowadays, when describing the Tibetan Buddhism to the broader outside world, there is still a significant need for a much more comprehensive, nuanced, and accurate understanding in this particular regard. Therefore, I was considering that everyone gathered here today, each one of you present, who have engaged in very deep and thorough research, whether in the field of sociology, human, historical, and cultural studies. Especially regarding the subject of religion, many individuals have conducted some very profound research into this area. If you want to conduct in-depth research, first gaining a thorough understanding is crucial. If you haven't thoroughly understood a culture, then when you begin to portray or characterize it, there's bound to be a certain distance or gap in your understanding. So we're thinking that, on one hand, Tibetan Buddhism encompasses various schools and sects, each with their own profound and intricate teachings and doctrines. Of course, these profound teachings, I think we very likely won't be able to cover a great deal of them today. There are quite certain aspects that everyone should be cognizant of. But overall, one is understanding from a theoretical perspective, and the other is understanding from the perspective of practice. These two must be made clear. If you understand it theoretically, then there are now some truly fascinating historical books available, and there may also be some significant and important teachings, including within Tibetan Buddhism, the 5 great treatises, which are fundamental texts, as well as in Vajrayana, the Kriya, Charya, and highest Yoga Tantras, and so on. These particular kinds of practices, this is from a purely theoretical perspective, offering a foundational understanding. It's similar to how we conduct research in higher education today. We can study and contemplate. This is one way of understanding from a theoretical standpoint. There is also another way, a deeper understanding that comes from actual practice. The approach of understanding through actual practice truly requires that we integrate it with its established and practical methods of practice. Only in this way can we truly comprehend its fundamental and essential content. Otherwise, if we just read 1 or 2 books, we may not truly and deeply understand. For example, in the profound and ancient tradition of Tibetan Vajrayana, specifically within the revered Great Perfection, Dzogchen teachings of the esteemed Nyingma school, it is essential to grasp the full scope. Now, the Great Perfection, in fact, its lineage and are especially exceptionally and remarkably sublime. But this kind of sublimity is not commonly found in many written texts or historical documents. Even in our Tibetan Kangyur, the Dzogchen Tantras, mainly the 17 Tantras, are not included in the Dirge edition of the Kangyur. There is a separate collection of Tantras because at the time there was concern about revealing the secrets. Why is this precisely the case? It's not because tantric practices have significant flaws or defects that they're afraid of being exposed or leaked out, but if complete secrecy can be carefully maintained, it holds a very deep and significant, profound importance. Therefore, some of the teachings of the Great Perfection, if we only look at them from the perspective of the written word or theory, they might seem similar to other schools like Yogacara or Madhyamaka, and you can't really see any difference. But if you diligently follow the established rules of the Vajrayana and wholeheartedly rely on a qualified lineage master, and then subsequently rely on his sacred lineage to engage in dedicated practice, then after many years you will fully understand some of the most profound meanings within. Now, of course, this process takes a very long time to complete. For example, regarding some of the profound origins and the esteemed lineage masters of the Great Perfection. Actually, all of us in Xi'an, yesterday as I was coming here, I was thinking about this. There is still a very deep karmic connection. At the very beginning, our Great Perfection patriarchs and those in the Han region, Professor Liu specializes in the study of Vajrayana Buddhism. There are many similarities in the lineages between Esoteric Buddhism and Tang Esotericism. For example, in Tang Esotericism, it starts with Vairakana Buddha. Then comes Vajrasattva, followed by Nagarjuna Bodhisattva. After Nagarjuna Bodhisattva opened the southern heavenly iron tower, he passed the teachings to Longji. Longji then transmitted them to the 3 great masters of the Kayuan era in China, Shubhakara Simha, Vajrabodhi, and Amoga Vajra, among others. This is how the lineage was passed down. So, from the Buddha to the human world, the teachings have been transmitted in this way. Our Dzogchen lineage is similar. In the beginning it was Samantabhadra Tathagata and Vajradhara. Then this precious teaching was passed down to Garabdorje, who is also widely known as the Vajra of Supreme Joy. After receiving the transmission, the Vajra of Supreme Joy later passed it on to Manjushri Mitra. Manjushri Mitra then passed it on to who? To Shri Singha. Shri Singha was actually of Han Chinese descent, but as for exactly which historical era he lived in, many historical records widely indicate that it was during the early and flourishing Tang dynasty. He was originally from a prominent city in the Han region. Then he journeyed to India, where he diligently studied under the esteemed Manjushri Mitra. After studying extensively with Manjushri Mitra and successfully obtaining the profound Dzogchen instructions, he returned to the Han region, to a place called Qingliang Charnel Ground. But as for the exact location of Qingliang Charnel Ground today, some scholars believe it is near Mount Wutai, while others think it is elsewhere. While he was living there, at that particular time, Vimalamitra and Yeshe-do, who was also widely known as Jnanasutra, were present. The 2 of them were in a garden at Vajrasana in India. While they were in the garden, Vajrasattva appeared in the sky and prophesied to them, saying, "Although you have been great sages for 500 lifetimes, If you truly and sincerely wish to attain profound and lasting accomplishment in this very life, then you should certainly go to the esteemed Han region and humbly receive the sacred and profound instructions directly from the revered Master Shri Singha. At that precise moment, Vimalamitra immediately and without hesitation went forth, but for reasons unknown at that time, Jnana Sutra did not come then. When Vimalamitra arrived here, he received many profound Dzogchen instructions from the Venerable Shri Singha, a highly respected master. Some of these were hidden away, and it is widely said that at that time in Chang'an, which is also known as Xi'an, within an imperial palace, there were many such items. There was a place called Auspicious Gate, and this place was also called Auspicious Gate. I've previously looked this up in related historical records, but now, perhaps because too much time has passed, there isn't anything very clear. There are no records in Chinese sources, but according to many great masters and some historical accounts, including many Tibetan historical records, it is all acknowledged to be Xi'an. At that time, part of the instructions was hidden inside this pillar. He stayed there for many years, deeply immersing himself in study and practice. Upon his eventual return, he shared all of his experiences with Jnana Sutra. Inspired by what he heard, Jnana Sutra decided to travel to China as well. He studied extensively under Shri Singha, and the period he spent under him was relatively long. He only attained the highest levels of Vajrayana realization much later on. At that particular time, when Shri Singha was nearing parinirvana, he passed on his profound 7 nails instructions to Jnana Sutra. Subsequently, Jnana Sutra then returned to a specific place in India known as the Barsing Charnel ground. While he was residing there, Vimalamitra later went to see Jnana Sutra once again. When he was nearing parinirvana, he transmitted to him the profound pith instructions of Dzogchen's 4 methods of resting. Later, he subsequently passed this important teaching on to Vimalamitra. Vimalamitra transmitted it to Guru Padmasambhava, and Guru Padmasambhava brought it to Tibet. In fact, the true and unbroken lineage of Dzogchen originated at the very beginning with the primordial Buddha, Samantabhadra Tathagata. Of course, the Dzogchen teachings and the broader Vajrayana teachings are intimately interconnected and form a comprehensive spiritual system. In fact, during the time when Shakyamuni Buddha was in the world, there were also many Vajrayana teachings. According to the Kalachakra Tantra, the Manjushri Namasamgiti, and similar texts, these were personally spoken by the Buddha. Other Vajrayana teachings appeared after his parinirvana. There are such cases as well. So regarding these matters, of course, for those who are not familiar with certain histories and special lineages, they may truly indeed have all kinds of different ideas and opinions, which is quite completely understandable. Speaking from the perspective of lineage, for example, the Chan Zen tradition. In point of fact, within the Vajrayana lineage, there is a very specific transmission, also known as the Vidyadhara symbolic transmission. The Vidyadhara symbolic transmission and the Chan tradition's method of mind-to-mind transmission are, in their fundamental essence, exactly the same. For example, in Chan Buddhism, it relies on a certain action or interaction, such as the venerable master saying some profound Chan words to the diligent disciple, or the master giving some kind of insightful instruction. For example, when a simple piece of tile is thrown somewhere, upon hearing it, one immediately attains profound enlightenment. There are many such stories in the Chan tradition. The same is true in Vajrayana. For instance, Padmasambhava, when instructing disciples with the right karmic connection, would ask, "Where is the sky? Where is the sky?" With just such a phrase, the disciple, if they have the right connection, would instantly become enlightened. Indeed, such situations do exist. But as for us, if you only approach this from an academic research perspective, trying to understand the meaning behind it, then not only with regard to the profound Tibetan Vajrayana tradition, but also with the Pure Land and Chan Buddhism schools, I think that using academic research to understand their attainments and states of practice is truly impossible, because academia is not a form of blind faith at all. It is fundamentally based on profound wisdom or logical reasoning. For some things, if you genuinely lack a certain unwavering faith or strong confidence, then it will definitely be quite difficult to achieve. In our world today, aside from facts, there also exists a rather mysterious kind of faith. Some people nowadays say this: what's the difference between scriptures? What's the use of lineage? All of these are unnecessary things. To just talk about material things and ignore the mind. But actually, this is unreasonable. In the past, Master Hongyi once gave an example. I think this is still correct. People need a kind of faith. Without faith, there are some profound things that we cannot necessarily express with our discriminating thoughts or our logical minds. For example, if you want to meticulously draw a national emblem on a piece of cloth, At that time, Master Hongyi probably didn't have this example. Maybe it was during the Kuomintang era. He used the national flag as an example. Say you draw a national flag. If you draw a national flag originally, it's just a piece of cloth. And drawing a symbol on it doesn't seem to matter much. But after you have completely finished drawing it, its inherent value becomes entirely different. For example, according to current law, if you deliberately burn the national flag, you can be sentenced to more than 3 years in prison. Why is that? Because of the pattern on it. Originally, there's just a pattern on it, and it doesn't really mean much. But if you intentionally and really truly burn it in human society, you'll be sentenced to more than 3 years in prison. Why is that? There is a certain reason for it. Whether it's our current scriptures or the blessings truly found in Buddhist texts, when viewed from an academic perspective, in many respects indeed, the conclusions that may be drawn are entirely theoretical. These theoretical things can only capture a part of the true meaning. Nowadays, many people, including those who look at the rainbow body attainment in Tibetan Buddhism, often find themselves in a state of wonder, find it a bit hard to understand. I think it's reasonable not to understand. However, this phenomenon is actually not something that's unique or exclusive to Tibetan Buddhism alone. During the Jin dynasty period, the very first bhikkhuni, fully ordained nun, in the Han region was Master Jingqian. When Master Jingqian manifested at the end, it was exactly as described in the history of Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism. She did not abandon her physical body and went directly to the Pure Land. This was later, probably during the Liang dynasty. At that time, it is believed that this significant development occurred. There are records of this in many historical documents. This is widely recognized. If you say that some rainbow body attainments in Tibetan Buddhism are unreasonable, then perhaps this particular history truly needs to be carefully re-examined, because she completely transformed her physical body into a special kind of ethereal light and then departed. There are historical documents about this. In the past, when Master Longlian explained the Heart Sutra, she cited this particular story. Later on, I specifically looked up some relevant information, Chinese texts like the biographies of eminent monks. Indeed, I have found the original classical texts. And also, regarding Jushikjing, just recently, I happened to be giving teachings on the Prajna Samgrahagata. At that particular time, when Jushikjing undertook the translation of the Prajna Dharma, he was held in especially high esteem and greatly respected by the emperor, who deeply appreciated his profound efforts. But later, when he manifested his parinirvana, it was also very similar to many of the rainbow body stories found in Tibet. They were almost identical auspicious signs. These are also recorded in history. So sometimes we have a lot of misunderstandings about Tibetan Buddhism. This is something we might need to set aside. Otherwise, as academic researchers, it can still be quite difficult for people to truly understand. Especially, I think, of course, there are two ways to understand Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism. One is through texts and history, to learn about it in this way. Relying solely on academic study should be sufficient for this. The other way is to truly experience it yourself. For instance, when it comes to the real essence and profound core of tantric thought, the language used to describe it might sound just the same as other historical traditions or schools, like the Yogacara school, essentially identical to them. But if you genuinely and truly want to understand it, you need to genuinely, for instance, in the profound teachings of Dzogchen, only by starting actual and dedicated practice can you truly and deeply grasp its profound meaning. So when we talk about practice, we begin with the preliminary practices. According to Dzogchen, the preliminary practices are divided into common and uncommon preliminaries. The common preliminaries include the rarity of human birth, the impermanence of life, the suffering of samsara, and the infallibility of karma and its effects. These principles can be understood through the guidance of a qualified teacher. But when we truly want to practice, we start with contemplating the rarity of human birth, which is indeed extremely precious. If we only discuss this academically, many people may not be able to truly grasp it. That's why I just mentioned, when you truly and sincerely want to practice, faith is indeed very much important. Without faith, no matter how much you explain to someone from a theoretical perspective, no matter how many scriptures or treatises there are, even if you study thousands of texts, the academic understanding and the practical realization gained through actual hands-on experience are often completely separate and distinct entities. That's why we have a saying in Tibet which perfectly encapsulates this idea, that books written purely through very academic research are truly very different from books written from a deep and profound place of true and authentic inner realization. Of course, there are some individuals who, perhaps due to karmic connections and merit from previous lives, truly display a great deal of effortless wisdom in this lifetime. For example, the teacher I once followed, you may have heard of him as well, His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche. I closely followed His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche for nearly 20 years of my life. He is the person I admire and revere the most in my entire life. I've met many people, both in China and abroad, truly a great number of them, many who are wise, compassionate, and talented. There have been so many. But from a very truly impartial and completely fair standpoint, and not simply because he was my teacher that I praise him, it's not like that at all. It's entirely from my own truly deep personal conscience, and with a fair attitude when making an assessment. His profound kind of wisdom is truly and utterly beyond the comprehension and reach of ordinary people. For many of us, for example, when we write books, for us, it is often the case that we have to consult many books, and we certainly need to prepare thoroughly. That's just how it is for us. However, he, on the other hand, generally doesn't require any preparation at all. When he began to write, everything simply flows out effortlessly from his inherent wisdom. In a very short period of time, he could write so many articles. All of these profound scriptural references would come entirely from his innate wisdom. Back then, in the year 1990, my esteemed teacher went to India. At that particular time, he appeared to have significantly poor eyesight, and he gave a comprehensive lecture at the Advanced Buddhist Institute. But during the lecture, he cited many diverse scriptural sources, including references from both Vajrayana and Sutrayana, such as the Avatamsaka Sutra and the Lotus Sutra. Sometimes he would recite long passages from memory, one after another. After he finished reciting, a few of us disciples sitting below would open the texts and look for the original passages, and they were all exactly the same. Of course, with diligent practice, an ordinary person might be able to do this, but to accomplish it in such a short period of time is extremely, extremely difficult. In Tibetan Buddhism, there is something called mind terma. Mind terma, perhaps some of you have studied terma teachings before. Actually, in Tibet, the most supreme Dharma teachings are called terma treasures. Terma treasures are extremely, extremely rare. This includes their rituals and tantras, all of which are especially worth studying in the future. But unfortunately, there aren't many translations in Chinese at present. In the past, in Boston and Washington in the United States, there were several PhD students specifically working on this. They studied the Dharma teachings related to terma in Tibetan Buddhism. Some of these Dharma teachings were buried. At that time, Guru Padmasambhava, for the benefit of future sentient beings, deliberately concealed them in sacred mountains, lakes, in the sky, and so on. Later, these great masters and eminent monks, using his signs and prophecies, would then go to those specific places, and when they finally arrived, small treasure chests would directly appear. These treasure chests could be opened using the Kini script. Once opened inside, there would be, for example, large volumes upon large volumes, which in today's terms would be dozens and dozens of books. All of them were meticulously written down in that particular kind of ancient script, carefully preserved. Later, when reading them, the writing was also different from the characters we normally write with our conceptual mind. The practices contained within were all especially extraordinary. So when we talk about this, for example, in Vajrayana, we start practicing by contemplating rarity of human birth and impermanence of life. When you begin to practice, whether you are practicing terma teachings or other methods, you practice in this way. After you have completed basic preliminary practices, there are also uncommon practices such as taking refuge, generating bodhicitta, confession, mandala offerings, and so on. Including practices like phawa, these are called preliminary practices. After practicing these preliminaries for many years, when you are truly able to generate the corresponding states of realization, then you can further advance to practice even higher Vajrayana teachings, such as the generation stage, completion stage, Mahayoga, Anuyoga, and so on. There are many profound teachings. As for these profound teachings, I think that today, even though I have previously translated related Vajrayana materials, including quite a lot on history and practice methods, some of them are not suitable for public disclosure. Although they are not made public, some are secretly being sold everywhere. But even if they're sold, it doesn't really matter because it's just the text ending up in someone else's hands. But if you don't have the actual lineage and haven't practiced, especially if you lack faith, then even if you read it, at most it's like any other Dharma text. You won't be able to see anything special in it. Everyone knows the Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch is available for anyone to read. But those with the right karmic connection can attain enlightenment after reading the Platform Sutra. Whereas without its lineage, without that connection, one might feel that it's really no different from other ancient and sacred texts, just like the Tao Te Ching or the Bible. Most people probably can't tell the difference. But in fact, in our Nyingma tradition, I'm not praising ourselves or disparaging others, this really is the case. For many years, deep within my heart, I have engaged in long-term study, especially of the profound Nyingma Dzogchen teachings. It truly is a direct way for people to cut through afflictions, or for the Buddha's profound intent to be expressed quite straightforwardly. Such Dharma methods, especially in this degenerate age, are indeed extremely rare and profound. Of course, to truly practice such sacred teachings, one must first receive the proper empowerment, and only after diligently completing many extensive preliminary practices can one genuinely engage in them. For these profound teachings, one must absolutely rely on the appropriate and experienced teacher, as well as many personal conditions such as faith, before one can enter the realm of practice. I truly hope that many students, as well as their dedicated teachers, will find this information useful. In the future, when it comes to the topic of Tibetan Buddhism, of course, whether or not you have personal faith depends entirely on your own individual situation. This is completely up to you. However, the conclusions you ultimately reach from an academic perspective and those you reach from actual practical experience are completely different. Moreover, due to significant language barriers that existed in the past, as well as various historical reasons specifically related to transportation and numerous other interconnected aspects. Nowadays, to be honest, in the Han regions regarding Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism, including misunderstandings about Tibetan Buddhism, there are still quite a lot. Some time ago, I went to the Chinese University of Hong Kong to review students' essays with the university students. I heard that here I know a student from your side, and at that particular time, students from this very place also came, and in the end, it was a truly remarkable experience. I spoke very frankly. I said, many university students, having such faith and interest in this area is truly great, but I still feel a bit regretful that their overall understanding of Tibetan Buddhism is not deep enough, including many of the specific things they wrote about, like Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism and certain significant aspects of Tibet, for example, the rich Thangka culture and the historically notable charnel grounds. Many aspects are simply seen as something very rare. Even now, many people, when it comes to Tibet, for example, human bones and such things, are approached with a sense of curiosity. They see it entirely as something quite really theatrical in that particular way. But this means that the deeper teachings of esoteric practices in Tibet are definitely not understood clearly at all. Therefore, I also sincerely hope that in the very near future, we can establish good and robust platforms in all relevant aspects. And first, we should study these things academically, which is very necessary. In fact, whether it's Tibetan Buddhism or any practice or history, all of these can truly and fully indeed withstand the scrutiny of history. This is supported by so many treatises and the achievements and histories of previous eminent monks and great masters. These are completely and utterly different from some of the superstitious folk religions that exist in the world today. It's absolutely not like that at all. However, when we find ourselves in this particular situation, if we truly want to fully understand its complete history and its established practices, it certainly requires various favorable and specific conditions. Therefore, I believe that today I haven't really prepared anything substantial. I'm simply articulating whatever thoughts spontaneously come to my mind at this moment. I think it might be better if we have some interaction and discuss things with each other. There shouldn't be anything else.